Hello class. First off, I would like to stop and take a chance to introduce myself to the course. My name is Courtney Hale, and I will be getting ready to talk about my topic in just a few seconds. As you see, you can't see the screen too good, and that's my apologies. I've tried the best I can to do it this way instead of making an audio clip, but today I will be presenting my presentation on orchid fungal symbiosis. And as I move through the slides, I will have to go to my computer to turn the flicker because I have no flicker, to change for my slides. So I'll get started and hope you enjoy. Orchid fungal symbiosis are microbial fungi, for the survival of a potentially endangered orchid. We will find that out sometimes during here. Okay, the first scientific study was done by the French scientist by the name of Noel Bernard in May of 1899. He discovered it under a log in a forest germinating orchid seeds. He saw that the seedlings contained microbial fungi and it depended upon them for nutrients. It's important because not all fungi have the same ability to stimulate growth of the seedlings. He also concluded that microbial fungi are potential parasites that controlled reactions of the host cells. He also looked at the association as a disease, but he thought it would be beneficial to the orchids. Young orchid seedlings. This is before the orchid actually becomes an orchid. It is first a seed at its beginning stages. The young orchid seedlings, also known as protocorms, and this is known as where the fungus is restricted to the basal part, and they are very small. They are no more than a few cells long, and they're given the name dust seeds because they're so small and they look just like dust. And they can produce millions of seeds per flower. They lack endosperms and will only germinate, which would mean they would only be able to grow and develop if infected by the fungal host. So if they do not get infected by a fungal host, then there will be no germination. And it is dependent on fungi due to a lack of leaves and roots because it can uptake carbohydrates, minerals, and water. Okay, this figure that we see now on the screen that you barely can see is actually a young orchid seedling. As you can see here, the little bitty strings that you see, those are millions of stringlings. Okay, now we're going to get to the part and talk about the adult orchid. It is the large family on Earth, and it's produced its own food by photosynthesis. And if you take note here, you'll see during this presentation that you will see that not all of them will have photosynthesis. And it contains 10% of all plants. It's considered a parasite on fungi. Not all of them are considered parasites. They are also epiparasites on fungi to neighboring photosynthetic trees. And the orchids depend on the fungal host for nutrients. So without the fungal host, it has no nutrients to survive and thrive. The epiphytic orchids are less dependent than the terrestrial orchids. Not all orchids require their own organic carbon. This is figure 2. This is a nice picture of an adult orchid. As you can see, it is not infected with any of the fungi. Okay, now we're going to talk about orchids being endangered. The need for forests filled with fungi depends on the forest age, its fungi, and its habitat loss. The reasons for orchids being threatened or endangered could be environmental issues that are are those reasons that, you know, they can threaten the orchids. Okay, so back to orchids. There was a study done by Smithsonian Institute. Remember, this is going to be their first study. Back in 1888, Noel Bernard, he was the first one to even look at the orchid itself. So I mentioned that in the beginning of the paper to let you know that orchids have been studied and tested since 1899, and it's still going on today. So that lets us know how important this matter is. The first study conducted by Smithsonian Institute, the study conducted 3 orchid species endangered in one or more U.S. states. There has been dozens of orchid seeds planted in experimental plots, and only half of the orchids had added host fungi. So when they did their experiment, half of their plots were added with the host fungi. So we'll see later on if that added fungi had anything to do with the growth of the fungi. So they had 6 study sites, and they had 3 in younger forests, ranging from 50 to 70 years old, and 3 in older forests, ranging from 120 to 150 years old. And the study lasted about 4 years. Within the study, the orchid seeds germinated only where fungi was abundant. The Leparius lilifolia, or also known as the lily leaf twigblade, only germinated where there was added fungi. So here that it tells us that this certain species only germinated because of the added fungi, and it could survive in many places. So the need for this species does not exist in most areas, such as forests. Okay, we'll continue with orchid study. So all of the fungi identified belong to the genus Rhizoctonia. Excuse me for pronouncing that wrong. They belong to the class Basidiomyces, and the order was Certobasidiales, Ixodiales, and Tulsiniales. Excuse me for pronouncing kind of wrong, but I tried. And the fungi identified were found on the orchids in different ones. Okay, so now we'll talk about the host fungi. Previously, we were talking about the orchid. So now we'll go into further detail and talk about the host fungi, which you'll learn that it's going to be very beneficial to the orchids. Little is known about the survival of the orchids from the host fungi. The host fungi has a preference for older forests, which would range from 120 to 150 years of age. Soil samples from older forests had more abundance of fungi than the younger ones. And this was even with the addition of added fungi. So even though in the study there was added fungi, it was not as great as the ones from the older forest versus a younger forest. The fungi was 5 to 12 times the amount when compared in contrast from the younger forest and the older forest. So we found that the older forest had more diversity, and the primary decomposers, that's what was needed so that they could grow better in places of decomposing wood and where leaves were very plentiful. Okay, so we'll continue again with the host fungi. The Tussolini fungi species, this is known as the species of fungi that we found on the orchids. Now, they were beneficial to orchids in the mature plots. This means that these were the older plots that were older in age. And on tests, they compared the older plots against the younger plots, and it didn't give any units. So I was letting you know because there's none up here. So the mature plots average from 3.6 compared to 1.3 in the younger plots. Okay, so this is another type of fungi. This one is the cultural dependent fungi, which is going to be the actual testing of fungi within using the microscope and looking at it microscopically instead of just looking at it on a on the forest in the forest. Okay, so this study was conducted at a university in Italy, and the fungi were placed on agar plates to grow and germinate in vitro isolation, and they were kept in dark places for the germination process to occur. And afterwards, they were placed in light when the leaf shoots began to turn green. Okay, this figure that we see here is a nice green orchid plant. As you can see, there is no fungi present on it. It's pretty and green and has a plentiful amount of chlorophyll. Nice and pretty. Okay, continuing with the cultural dependent fungi. We revealed a diverse spectrum of fungi associated with orchid species. So these are the 4. And I'm not going to try to pronounce those, so I hope you can see them because they're kind of hard to say. But out of the 4 that were conducted, there were 2 that were in the lower fungal diversity, and there were 2 more that were in the higher fungal diversity. So the study conducted microbial fungi is not restricted to non-photosynthetic orchids. The term mycorrhizal fungi, we'll get to that later on. That just means that the orchid has been infected by a fungus. So now we'll talk about the orchid fungal symbiosis. The orchids have a symbiotic or a cooperative relationship with a fungus. In the next slide, we'll see figure 4. We'll see a nice picture of it. The fungus feeds the orchid seed. The orchid roots protect the fungus. And with these 2, you'll see that the fungus can feed the orchid seed and the orchid roots that will protect the fungus. You really won't see it in the picture because you can't see it that good, but I was just letting you know that's what's happening in that picture. So each species of orchids binds with a particular species of fungus in order for an orchid to propagate. So here's the picture of an orchid mycorrhizal fungi. As you can see, it's purple. You can't really see it too good on here either. And if you look in the middle of it, you will see that there's the mycorrhizal fungi on it that has infected the plant itself. Okay, I just put this one up because I wanted you to see that there's a difference between the 2. I just wanted you to see a comparison. So I got information for a bird nest orchid, and it does not contain chlorophyll. We'll see in figure 5 right here. As you can see, it is not green. It doesn't have any green pigment to it, so therefore we know that it doesn't have any chlorophyll. And it's unable to synthesize its own food using sunlight, versus the other one could use sunlight, the photosynthesis, in order for some processes to take place when it comes to feedings. So the needed fungi is needed to invade its seeds before they can germinate, and they retain the fungus throughout its life. So the bird nest orchid, it will always have the fungus forever, and that's as long as it has any life. So now we'll talk about the orchid fungus relationship. To this date, there has been little known about the relationship itself. So the orchid root cells consist of stringy fungal masses called pelotons. And on the next slide, we will see that description. It will be figure 6. And you'll see that it wraps up inside itself, and then it's digested by the orchid. And that symbiotic relationship with the mycorrhizal fungi is where the photosynthetes transfer the fungi from the plant. Also, the symbiotic relationship means that the orchid is obtaining its nutrients. So as long as the orchid has some type of relationship with the fungi, then we know that it's getting nutrients in the proper manner that it needs it. Okay, back to the orchid fungus relationship. As you can tell by now that the orchid and the microbial fungi has a close relationship to one another, which means that they're symbiotic, that one benefits from the other and the other benefits from it. So I've already said this term, the mycorrhiza, and basically it colonizes soils at the barks of trees, and it penetrates the living tissues of the orchids. The exact process of symbiosis is poorly understood. The fungus digests organic materials, and the nutrients are transferred to the cells of the orchid by diffusion, which by now we all know what diffusion is, and the digestion by the orchid host. Oh, okay. Here we go is the fungal peloton that we see in this figure right here. Sorry that you really can't see it that much. And here is, you see the orchid microbial fungi, and you see the little strings that are wrapped around them, like I mentioned in the previous slide. So does the orchid have a dependency? And if it does, what is its dependency? Maybe fungi, microbial fungi. We'll see later on. So it needs microscopic fungi in its early 8 stages of life. Without any nutrients from the host fungi, the seeds will not germinate, and therefore the baby orchids will not grow and germinate and become an orchid. We mentioned earlier that the older forests were plentiful and better off for the orchid itself to survive and thrive. So planting a new forest may not just be enough because it's too new and it doesn't have all the fungi that most of the orchids need. So the performance depends on the abundance of the fungi. So if you don't have an abundance of fungi, then the probability that you will have nice, pretty orchids growing in the forest, you get it. So the green orchids, they depend on specific microbial fungal symbionts, and these will have chlorophyll. They also have a supply of carbohydrates in order to grow. And their dependency will vary within whatever genre or species that they could be in. So the orchids having organic carbon are less reliant on the mycorrhizal fungi. Okay, so saving the endangered orchids. In order to save the endangered orchids, older forests are needed. So why do we need an older forest? Because like we said earlier, the older forests have the more decomposing woods that the orchids and the fungi can thrive on and survive. And the younger forest does not contain the fungi needed for most orchids to thrive. So why do you think, or what do you think could help younger forests have the ability or capabilities for a forest to thrive when it's not as old? And as you see, here is my reference list. Well, I guess if you have questions, I guess I can't answer them because I'm not available. But if you do have any questions, feel free to email me at jsu9286m@jsu.edu, and I will try to respond to you as quickly as I can. So I hope that you all have enjoyed my presentation with the orchid fungal symbiosis. And what do you all think about the orchid fungal symbiosis?